Manchester built the industrial north. For the women in this list, it was something else entirely. 5 children buried on a moor, a 15-year-old who planned a killing, cocaine prepared from a house in Clayton, a 72-year-old running a stash house. This is Manchester's most notorious women. Section 1. Myra Hindley. On the morning of 7th of October 1965, a 17-year-old man named David Smith walked to a telephone box on Underwood Court in Hattersley, a housing estate on the eastern edge of Manchester, and called the police. He had spent the night sitting in his kitchen with a bread knife, waiting for a knock at the door that never came. The call he made that morning would eventually bring to light something that the surrounding city of Manchester had not imagined possible: that behind the walls of a terraced council house less than a mile away, a young woman from Gorton had spent 2.5 years helping to murder 5 children. The woman's name was Myra Hindley. She was 23 years old. Myra Hindley was born on 23 July 1942 at Crumpsall in the north of Manchester. Her father, Bob Hindley, was a paratrooper who came home from the war altered by what he had seen. Neighbours and family later described him as a man who resolved disputes with his fists and who encouraged his daughter, from an early age, to use violence as a first response to any challenge. Her mother Nellie was quieter and largely absent from Myra's childhood in any meaningful way. When Myra was still a small child, the family relocated to Gorton, a district of terraced streets south of the city centre, and Myra was sent to live with her grandmother on Beasley Street. She would remain there through her childhood and adolescence, raised on a street of red brick houses a few minutes' walk from the places where the first of her victims would later disappear. Gorton, in the 1950s, was a working-class district. Mills, small engineering firms, back entries between tightly packed rows of houses. Children played on the streets in the evenings. Myra Hindley grew up as part of that landscape, attending school locally, forming friendships, attending church, and by most accounts unremarkable. What her teachers and neighbours later struggled to reconcile with the events of 1963 to 1965 was that nothing in her outward presentation suggested what was coming. She was described by schoolmates as confident, sometimes combative, and physically capable. She converted to Roman Catholicism in her teens, inspired by the death of a close friend and her own developing sense of guilt and meaning. She trained as a shorthand typist. In January 1961, at the age of 18, she began working at Millwoods Merchandising, a wholesale chemical distribution company in Gorton, and there she met a man called Ian Brady. Brady was then 22. He had been convicted of theft as a young man in Glasgow, had spent time in a borstal, and had returned to Manchester in 1957 to live with his mother and stepfather. He had worked at Millwoods since early 1959. He read voraciously, carrying books on Nazi history and the writings of the Marquis de Sade to his desk in the stockroom. Colleagues remembered him as private, precise, and quick-tempered. Myra Hindley noticed him from her first weeks at the company. She kept a diary at the time in which she recorded her fascination with him, her desire to be noticed by him, her frustration at his apparent indifference. It took over a year before he asked her to go out with him. By the time he did, the dynamic between them had already been set. She wanted him to choose her, and once he did, she would not leave. What Brady offered Hindley was a worldview. He believed that conventional morality was a fiction, that murder was simply a taboo rather than an inherent wrong, that a person who could reason clearly enough would recognize that nothing in human conduct was truly forbidden. Hindley absorbed this framework. She later said in her own words, paraphrased from accounts of her prison writings, that she had known the difference between right and wrong, that she had not been compelled to act, that in some respects she was more responsible for what followed than he was, because she had understood the distinction and chosen to cross it anyway. That self-assessment, made decades after the crimes, is as close as the record comes to an accounting from her. The killing began in the summer of 1963. Pauline Reed was 16 years old and lived around the corner from Hindley's grandmother's house on Beasley Street in Gorton. On the evening of 12 July 1963, she was walking to a local dance when she was approached by Hindley, who was someone she recognized from the neighborhood. Hindley told her she had lost an expensive glove somewhere up on the moorland above the city, asked if Pauline would help her search. Pauline agreed, Brady was waiting on Saddleworth Moor, a stretch of elevated, treeless upland some 15 miles east of Manchester's centre. Pauline Reed was sexually assaulted and her throat was cut. Her body was buried in a shallow grave. Her disappearance was reported to the police. A search was mounted, nothing was found. She was 16 years old and she did not come home from a dance. The pattern repeated. John Kilbride was 12 years old and lived in Ashton-under-Lyne when he disappeared on 23 November 1963 from a market in the town centre. Keith Bennett, also 12, disappeared on 16 June 1964 from the Longsight district of Manchester, having left his home on Eston Street to visit his grandmother. Leslie Ann Downey was 10 years old. She vanished on Boxing Day of 1964 from a fun fair in Ancoats while her family was nearby. In each case, what the police faced was a disappearance with no obvious explanation and no body. The moorland searches produced nothing. The city did not connect these disappearances into a pattern because there was nothing visible to connect. Inside the house on Wardlebrook Avenue in Hattersley, where Brady and Hindley lived, were photographs and an audio tape. The photographs showed Hindley and Brady posed on Saddleworth Moor. The tape contained the recorded voice of a child. It was Leslie Ann Downey, asking to be allowed to go home. The final murder took place at the house on 6 October 1965. Edward Evans was 17. He was killed with an axe in the living room of the property, and David Smith, who was Hindley's brother-in-law and who Brady had been cultivating as a potential accomplice, was brought to the house that evening and witnessed it. Smith helped move the body upstairs. He spent the night in his own kitchen, terrified, before walking to the telephone box at Underwood Court and calling the police. Brady was arrested on 7th of October 1965. Officers found Evans's body wrapped in a plastic sheet in a bedroom. Hindley was not immediately charged, but a search of the property recovered a left luggage ticket for Manchester Central Station. The ticket led to 2 suitcases. Inside the suitcases were photographs of Leslie Ann Downey being posed in degrading positions and a recording of her voice. There were also photographs of Brady and Hindley at various locations on Saddleworth Moor. The gravity of what the photographs and the tape represented was immediately clear to the investigating officers. Hindley was arrested days after Brady. The trial opened at Chester Assizes on the 27th of April 1966. Brady and Hindley both pleaded not guilty. The evidence against them was substantial. The audio tape of Leslie Ann Downey was played in court. Both defendants sat in the dock and listened to it. The tape lasted approximately 16 minutes. Witnesses described the effect in the courtroom as shattering. Members of the press left the press gallery. Jury members wept. The recording was of a child pleading to be allowed to dress, to go home, to not be hurt, while adult voices spoke around her and instructions were given to her. Brady's voice was on the tape. Hindley's was not, though she was identified as having been present throughout. The jury returned its verdicts on 6 May 1966. Brady was convicted of 3 murders: Leslie Ann Downey, John Kilbride, and Edward Evans. Hindley was convicted of 2 murders, those of Downey and Evans, and of a separate count of harbouring Brady, with the knowledge that he had murdered Kilbride. The presiding judge, Justice Fenton Atkinson, passed life sentences on both. In remarks from the bench, he described Brady as wicked beyond the reach of ordinary language, but expressed the view that Hindley, separated from Brady's influence, might eventually be capable of rehabilitation. That assessment would preoccupy the courts and the Home Office for the next 4 decades. What made the case something beyond an ordinary murder trial was the specificity of the suffering it revealed. The evidence of the crimes was not merely a set of facts about deaths. It was a recording of a child's terror. It was a photograph of a young woman kneeling on a moorland grave. It was the understanding that the disappearances of Pauline Reed, Keith Bennett, and the others had happened in full public view, in familiar Manchester streets, and that no one had known. The case became fixed in the public imagination in ways that serious crime rarely manages. The mugshot of Hindley taken after her arrest, pale face and bleached hair against a dark background, became one of the most reproduced images in British criminal history. In prison, Hindley became a sustained and complicated presence in British public life for 36 years. She applied for parole multiple times. She formed close relationships with prison staff, and with the Catholic chaplain Lord Longford, who campaigned publicly for her release. She earned an Open University degree. She argued consistently that she had been transformed by Brady's influence, that she was no longer the woman who had stood in that dock, and that rehabilitation ought to mean what it said. The Home Office and a series of Home Secretaries disagreed. No Home Secretary in 3.5 decades was willing to authorize her release. The families of the victims, and the considerable portion of British public opinion they represented, made clear that release was unacceptable. In 1985, 20 years after their arrest, Brady and Hindley separately confessed to the murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, the two victims whose bodies had never been found. It was acknowledged that the confessions came partly from Hindley's hope that demonstrating remorse might improve her chances of parole, though the legal and moral calculation was disputed by everyone involved. In 1987, police took them separately to Saddleworth Moor to assist with the search. The conditions on the moor were difficult, a landscape of heather, peat, and wind that reveals nothing voluntarily. Hindley spent time on the moor, pointing at horizons and describing landmarks. In July of that year, the body of Pauline Reed was found, 24 years after her disappearance, not far from a point Hindley had identified. She was still recognizable. Her family buried her. The body of Keith Bennett was never found. Greater Manchester Police conducted multiple searches of the moor in subsequent decades, including searches using specialist ground-penetrating equipment. Nothing has been recovered. His mother Winnie spent the remainder of her life writing letters to Brady in prison, asking him to identify the location. Brady never provided it. Winnie Johnson died in August 2012, without an answer. Keith Bennett's grave remains unmarked and unlocated somewhere in the peat above Manchester. Myra Hindley died on the 16th November 2002 at HMP High Point South in Suffolk. She was 60 years old. The cause of death was bronchial pneumonia. Her ashes were scattered at a location not publicly disclosed. There was no state marking of her death. She had been a prisoner for 36 years, making her at that point the longest-serving female prisoner in British legal history. Ian Brady survived her by 15 years. He died on 15th May 2017 at Ashworth High Secure Hospital in Merseyside, where he had been held under the Mental Health Act since 1985. He died still refusing to reveal the location of Keith Bennett's grave. What the Hindley case represents, in the context of Manchester's criminal history, is something that does not reduce easily to the language of organised crime, or drug supply, or gang warfare. It represents instead the particular capacity of violence to emerge from the most ordinary geography, from a street in Gorton, from a workplace in the same district, from a fun fair in Ancoats, and a market in Ashton-under-Lyne, and a housing estate in Hattersley. The city in which all of this happened was not a city at war with itself in any visible way. It was a city of terraced streets and mill buildings and people going to work, and beneath that surface, for 2.5 years, 5 children were taken to a moor and buried there. The moor is still there. The graves of 4 of those 5 children have been identified. 1 has not. That is where the case of Myra Hindley sits in the record, more than 60 years after the last murder. In an unresolved absence, on a piece of high ground above a northern city, under a horizon that changes nothing about what happened beneath it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Myra Hindley remains the most notorious female criminal Manchester has ever produced, a name that still generates argument about complicity, manipulation, and the limits of rehabilitation. Next, the video moves forward to a case that shocked a new generation, a teenage girl, a plan drawn up in private messages, and a killing in a park that was deliberate from its very first moment. Section 2, Scarlett Jenkinson Culcheth, is a village in the flat, quiet country between Warrington and the border of Greater Manchester. It has a high street, a library, a primary school, a community park running alongside the brook that gives the village part of its character. On a February Saturday afternoon in 2023, the park would have been cold, the trees bare, the ground soft from winter. People walked dogs there. It was the kind of place where a parent could send a child without particular anxiety, because nothing in the visible landscape of Culcheth Linear Park suggested it was anything other than what it appeared to be, an ordinary piece of open ground in an ordinary English village, quiet at 2 in the afternoon. At approximately 2 o'clock on 11 February 2023, a 16-year-old girl named Brianna Gay got off a bus at the stop outside the library in Colchester. She had travelled from her home in Birchwood, on the western edge of Warrington. She was a pupil at Birchwood Community High School and had been told, by a girl she believed was her friend, that there were drugs to be had at a meeting in the park. She had sent a message to that friend at 2:15 that afternoon, saying she was waiting and feeling anxious. At 2:30, she sent a message to someone else, saying the friend was acting strangely and she suspected the drugs were not real. Within minutes of sending that message, Brianna Gay was attacked with a hunting knife. She was stabbed 28 times across her head, neck, chest and back. She was found in the park and pronounced dead that afternoon. She was 16 years old and she had bought, on her friend's instruction, a single bus ticket to Colchester. The friend was Scarlett Jenkinson. Jenkinson was 15 years old at the time of the murder. She had grown up in Warrington, in what was described in court as an ordinary household. Both of her parents were teachers, and she had 3 older brothers. She had attended Colchester High School, where she had met a boy named Eddie Ratcliffe when she was around 11 years old. The two maintained a friendship and had, by late 2022, developed an increasingly extreme private world, conducted through text messages and shared notebooks, a private framework of ideas about violence, serial killers, and death that had, by the end of that year, reached the point where they began discussing killing a real person. Jenkinson kept physical notebooks in her bedroom containing writings about her interests in murder and torture. She had watched documentaries about notorious killers and had used a privacy browser to access videos of real violence on the dark web. She described herself to Ratcliffe as a Satanist and expressed particular admiration for the American serial killers Richard Ramirez and Jeffrey Dahmer. The trial later heard that Jenkinson's interests were not passive, they were directional. Jenkinson had arrived at Birchwood Community High School in November 2022, not quite 4 months before the murder. Her transfer there had come about because Colchester High School had moved to exclude her permanently following an incident in September of that year, when she provided cannabidiol-infused edibles to a younger pupil who became unwell. The school had recorded the incident as a spiking. Rather than proceed with the permanent exclusion, the school agreed to allow Jenkinson to transfer. She arrived at Birchwood and almost immediately began to form what appeared to the outside world to be a close friendship with Brianna Gay. What the friendship meant to Jenkinson was something different. In messages to Ratcliffe, she described Gay as someone she was obsessed with, and told him at one stage that she wanted to kill Gay so that she would always be with her. In a child psychiatrist's assessment conducted before sentencing, Jenkinson said she had feared losing Gay as a friend, and that this fear had become entangled with the violent ideas she and Ratcliffe had been developing together. What that means in practical terms is that Jenkinson had identified, in Brianna Gay, a person she could plausibly get close to, someone she found interesting, and also, in the calculation she was making at 15, someone who could be killed. What the prosecution presented in court was a sequence of planning that ran for weeks before 11 February 2023. Jenkinson and Ratcliffe had drawn up what they called a kill list, a group of 5 people they had decided to target, chosen on the basis of minor grievances and dislikes that would have been unremarkable in any other context. Brianna Gay was on it. Jenkinson told Ratcliffe that people around them knew Brianna was depressed and anxious, which made her easier to approach and easier to control. There had already been one attempt on Gay's life. Before the day in the park, Jenkinson had tried to kill Gay by giving her an overdose of ibuprofen tablets. That attempt failed. Gay either did not take enough or was not seriously harmed. The plan continued. When Jenkinson arranged for Gay to come to Colchester on 11 February, the arrangements were specific. Jenkinson used Snapchat to pose as a drug dealer, creating a fake persona to convince Gay that there were drugs available at the meeting. Gay was told to take a bus to Colchester and told explicitly to buy a single ticket rather than a return. Jenkinson also sent Ratcliffe a reminder to bring his knife. The planning existed in text messages, in a physical notebook, and in the logic of the choices made on the day itself. The prosecution described the murder as extremely brutal and punishing in its delivery. The 28 stab wounds were distributed across Gay's head, neck, chest, and back. A dog walker saw Jenkinson and Ratcliffe in the distance in the park that afternoon. Later analysis of bloodstaining on Ratcliffe's clothing indicated that he had been close to or involved in the stabbing, though forensic evidence as to precisely who delivered which wounds was inconclusive. Justice Yip, in her sentencing remarks, proceeded on the basis that both defendants had played a full part in the killing. After the murder, Jenkinson returned home and posted a tribute to Brianna Gay on Snapchat, writing that Gay had been one of the best people she had ever met and expressing apparent grief. The tribute was posted approximately an hour before Jenkinson was arrested. Officers who searched her bedroom found a notebook page on the floor, crumpled, titled "The Murder Plan." The note recorded the victim's name, the date of the killing, and the roles of the participants, who were assigned letters rather than names. A love heart and a smiley face had been drawn in the top corner of the page. When she was interviewed under arrest, Jenkinson laughed 17 times during the account she gave to officers, an account the court later found to be false in its material details. Ratcliffe was arrested simultaneously. He lived in the Lee area and had, by the time of the murder, been involved in the planning for what the prosecution described as weeks. He had competed as an amateur kickboxer at an international championship in Jamaica in 2018 and was described by classmates at Culcheth High School as someone who achieved top grades. Neither Jenkinson nor Ratcliffe had any previous involvement with the police before 11 February 2023. The pairing of the two was, in the language the trial eventually used, a case of two young people whose individual tendencies had been reinforced and escalated by each other's presence. A cocoon world that existed apart from everything else in their lives, that became progressively more extreme, and that ended in the death of a girl who had believed she was going to buy drugs on a Saturday afternoon, and had instead been lured to her murder by someone she thought was her friend. The trial opened at Manchester Crown Court in November 2023. Because both defendants were 15 at the time of the murder, they had been identified throughout the police investigation and early court proceedings only as Girl X and Boy Y. Both pleaded not guilty and spent the trial blaming each other. Jenkinson's defense presented the argument that while she may have lured Gay to the park and developed the plan, it was Ratcliffe who carried out the stabbing, and that she had been surprised by what he did. Ratcliffe's defense argued the opposite. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 40 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on both counts on 20th of December 2023. Justice Yip then ruled that the public interest in what she described as a plainly exceptional case justified lifting the anonymity orders that had protected both defendants' identities throughout the proceedings. The sentencing hearing took place on the 2nd February 2024. Victim impact statements were read on behalf of Brianna's family. Her mother, Esther Gay, told the court that both Jenkinson and Ratcliffe had exploited Brianna's need for companionship, that Brianna had been lonely and vulnerable and looking for a close friend, and that what she had found instead were two people who had been hunting her. Gay's father, Peter Spooner, who had needed time to accept Brianna's identity as a transgender girl, said in his statement that he had been proud of her and that the two killers had stolen from him the chance to develop the relationship he had begun to build with his daughter. Her sister said that she now found it difficult to trust anyone she had just met, because the person who had ended Brianna's life had presented itself as a friend. Jenkinson was sentenced to be detained at His Majesty's pleasure, the mandatory custodial sentence for defendants convicted of murder who were under 18 at the time of the offence. Justice Yip set the minimum term at 22 years, less the 352 days Jenkinson had spent on remand. If that deduction is applied, Jenkinson will be eligible for her first parole review on or around 25 January 2044, when she will be in her mid-20s. Ratcliffe received the same category of sentence with a minimum of 20 years. In the sentencing remarks that Justice Yip delivered from the bench, the characterization of the two defendants was precise and distinct. Jenkinson was identified as the driving force, described as having enjoyed the killing and as having been motivated by the desire to act out violent fantasies she had sustained and developed over time. The judge found that Jenkinson had brought Gay into the plan, specifically because she had identified Gay as a person who could be controlled and who would not be able to resist. The transphobia element of the offence, the fact that Ratcliffe's messages had contained hostility to Brianna's identity as a transgender girl, was found by the judge to have been a secondary motive for Ratcliffe, but not the primary motive for either of them. The primary motive was sadism. The killing had been planned and executed because Jenkinson had wanted to experience it. The psychiatric picture that emerged before sentencing was also specific. Jenkinson had been assessed by experts and initially assessed within a framework that included autism spectrum traits, but the court-appointed assessment concluded that the more accurate diagnosis was antisocial personality disorder. That distinction matters in the way the court interpreted her behavior. Antisocial personality disorder does not describe a condition that removes the capacity to understand consequences. It describes a condition characterized by consistent disregard for others, a pattern of manipulation, and the absence of remorse. The judge found that Jenkinson had understood perfectly well that what she was doing was wrong and had chosen to do it regardless. Ratcliffe, by contrast, was found to have a mild form of autism spectrum disorder, which the judge acknowledged as relevant, but which she found had limited effect on his culpability, given that the evidence showed he had been capable of understanding the consequences of his actions and had made a choice to participate. What the case of Scarlett Jenkinson represents in the context of this city's criminal record is something that sits outside the expected categories. The crime was not organized. It was not commercial. There was no drug line, no network, no money. What there was instead was a 15-year-old girl who had decided she wanted to kill someone, had identified a suitable target within the social landscape of a school in Warrington, and had spent weeks putting together the conditions under which the killing could happen. The victim was chosen because she was accessible and because she was thought to be easy to manipulate. The planning was detailed enough to specify a single bus ticket. The murder plan was written down in a notebook that she then left crumpled on her bedroom floor. Manchester Crown Court has dealt with a great many serious cases across its history. The sentencing of Scarlett Jenkinson on the 2nd February 2024 was among the most reported. Justice Yip's decision to lift the anonymity order meant the country learned, within hours, the name of the 15-year-old who had orchestrated a killing in a park. Jenkinson will not be eligible for release until the board is satisfied she is no longer dangerous, and Justice Yip made clear from the bench that the minimum term was exactly that, a minimum, not a release date. The killing she carried out was described in the judge's own words, paraphrased from the sentencing document, as sadistic in nature, planned over time, and delivered with full knowledge of what it would mean. Brianna Gay was born on 7 November 2006. She had a TikTok account where she danced to popular music. She had been excluded from school for a period before her death and was working to navigate the difficulties that came with that. She had been introduced to Scarlett Jenkinson through those difficulties, through the environment of an inclusion room where students not in mainstream lessons were brought together. She trusted her. She got on a bus to Colchester and bought a single ticket. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Scarlett Jenkinson remains one of the youngest people to receive a life sentence at Manchester Crown Court in recent decades. A case built on planning, on the exploitation of trust, and on a level of premeditation that the judge described as clearly established by the evidence. Next, the video covers another killing in Greater Manchester's orbit. A woman unknown to her victim, a park in Bolton, and a 7-year-old girl on a scooter who never made it home. Section 3. Eltiona Scarna. Queen's Park in Bolton sits about a mile north of the town centre, a municipal park of paths and open grass and a small lake. The kind of place that families have used on Sunday afternoons for generations. On 22 March 2020, it was Mother's Day. The coronavirus lockdown was 2 days away. Bolton was a town moving through an ordinary weekend, with an awareness that ordinary weekends were about to become scarce. In the park that afternoon, families were doing what families do in parks: walking, watching children, jogging. A 7-year-old girl was riding a scooter. Her father was nearby. Her mother, who worked as a solicitor, was jogging around the park's perimeter. The girl saw her mother and called out to her. Witnesses later recalled the sound of it, a small child spotting her mother across a park and calling out, as children do, instinctively, happily. Emily Jones died within minutes of that moment. She was attacked on her scooter by a woman who had been sitting on a park bench. The woman had come to Queen's Park that morning with a craft knife she had bought from a shop in Bolton town centre earlier in the day. She rose from the bench and moved toward the child. What happened next was witnessed and reported to the police by people in the park, including the member of the public who tackled the woman to the ground and held her until officers arrived. The woman did not resist at length. She was arrested on the scene. Emily Jones was 7 years old. She was taken to hospital and she did not survive. The woman who was arrested was called Eltiona Skana. Skana was 30 years old at the time of the attack. She had been born on 24 February 1990 in Albania and had arrived in the United Kingdom in August 2014, travelling through Germany, Italy and France before being smuggled across the channel in the back of a lorry. Her sister Klestora had arranged the journey through an agent. Before leaving Albania, Skana had been married in February 2012, had moved to Kuwait with her husband, and had returned to Albania in September 2013. The marriage, by the account Klestora later gave at the inquest into Emily Jones's death, had not been voluntary. Skana was described as having become depressed and withdrawn after returning from Kuwait. When she eventually came to the United Kingdom and settled first in London and then in Liverpool and then in Bolton, her mental health, which had already been deteriorating, became significantly worse. Her asylum application was made shortly after arrival. In it, Skana claimed to be a victim of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Both claims, she later admitted to medical staff, were lies. She had fabricated the account to improve her chances of being granted leave to remain. The asylum application was initially refused in June 2018, but Skana appealed and the decision was overturned. She was given a residency permit running until November 2020 and leave to remain in the United Kingdom until 2024. The Home Office was informed twice, through medical channels, that Skana had admitted to lying on her application. It was also recorded by doctors and police that on at least 2 separate occasions, in 2015 and 2017, Skana had told healthcare providers that she wanted to go home to Albania. Neither disclosure prompted a review of her immigration status. She remained in Bolton, living in a flat, unemployed, in receipt of state support, and by the early months of 2020, in a rapidly deteriorating mental state that nobody with the authority to act had managed to interrupt. The medical history that emerged at trial and at the subsequent inquest was detailed and troubling. Skana was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. In 2015, approximately a year after her arrival in the United Kingdom, she had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital following an incident in which she threatened her neighbours with a weapon. In 2017, she stabbed her own mother in the hand and attacked her sister. She was admitted to psychiatric hospitals on 3 separate occasions in total. Psychiatric evidence presented at her trial made clear that Skana's condition was manageable when she took her antipsychotic medication and that she became psychotically violent when she did not. A consultant forensic psychiatrist confirmed both points at trial. The pattern of stability when medicated and deterioration when not medicated was clearly established in her records. In August 2019, a decision was made by the team responsible for her care to change Skana's medication from an injectable form administered by a clinician to tablets, which she would take herself. Her sister, who had been living with her and monitoring her behaviour, later said at the inquest that she had disagreed with this change from the moment it was made because she had observed that Eltiona did not take her medication reliably. From around mid-December 2019 until 11th of March 2020, Skana had no face-to-face contact with anyone from her mental health team. When police searched her flat after her arrest, they found approximately a month's worth of untaken antipsychotic tablets. By the end of March, her sister had become alarmed. Klestora Skana described noticing that Eltiona was not sleeping at night, that she was showering and straightening her hair at 3 in the morning, that her behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic. 2 days before the attack, on 20th March 2020, Klestora took her sister to Bentley House, a mental health service in Bolton, in an attempt to have her reassessed and returned to injectable medication. They waited for 45 minutes. No doctor arrived. Eltiona got up from the waiting room and left. They went home. On the morning of 22 March 2020, Eltiona Skana woke at 11 o'clock, showered, and listened to music. She told her sister she was going to buy cigarettes. She went to a shop in Bolton town centre and bought a pack of 3 craft knives. She then went to Queen's Park. What she said to the psychiatric nurse at Rampton Secure Hospital in the weeks following her arrest was presented to the court at trial. She told him, in reported terms, that she had killed someone, that it had been premeditated, that she had waited in the park, that she had picked her victim, and that she had killed and then tried to run away. The nurse made a record of the conversation. It was given in evidence. The prosecution initially intended to use this statement, alongside the earlier purchase of the knives, to argue that the killing had been deliberate and purposeful in a legal sense that should meet the threshold for murder rather than manslaughter. The trial opened at Minshull Street Crown Court in Manchester on 26 November 2020. Skarna had entered her plea to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility on 6 November and had pleaded not guilty to the murder charge. The prosecution contested the not guilty plea and proceeded to trial. The case rested primarily on the psychiatric evidence and on whether Skarna's mental state at the time of the killing was severe enough to substantially impair her responsibility. Dr. Syed Afghan, the consultant forensic psychiatrist at Rampton who had been treating her, gave evidence that Skarna became psychotically violent when unmedicated, that her history of paranoid schizophrenia was ample and clearly documented, and that in his assessment, the attack on Emily Jones could not have been predicted. On the 6th day of the trial, the prosecution reviewed the psychiatric evidence and concluded there was no longer any realistic prospect of obtaining a conviction for murder. The jury was directed to formally return a not guilty verdict on the murder charge. The manslaughter conviction stood. Mr. Justice Wall sentenced Eltiona Skarna on 8 December 2020. She received a life sentence for manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. The minimum term he set was 8 years. 7 weeks later, in January 2021, Justice Wall corrected an error in his own calculation. Under rules that had taken effect from 1st of April 2020, the minimum term for a violent or sexual offender sentenced to 7 years or more should have been calculated as 2/3 of the notional determinate sentence, not 1/2, which was the older approach Justice Wall had inadvertently applied. He acknowledged the error plainly, took responsibility for it, and revised the minimum term upward to 10 years and 8 months. The revised minimum meant Skarna would not be eligible for consideration for release until she had served that period in a secure hospital, and would only be released if the relevant board concluded she was no longer dangerous. Mark Jones, Emily's father, welcomed the revision, but was not in any sense satisfied by it. He had described the original sentence as inadequate from the moment it was announced. In the months and years that followed, he pursued accountability from every institution he believed had failed his daughter. He made clear publicly that he considered Skarna should never be released, regardless of the minimum term served, because the nature of what she had done and the nature of the mental illness that drove it meant the risk could never be confidently assessed as resolved. He also pursued the Greater Manchester Mental Health NHS Trust, whose review of its own conduct following the killing concluded that the attack could not have been foreseen. Jones found that conclusion inexplicable and said so directly to the Trust's chief executive on more than one occasion. He described the internal review as disgraceful, noting that the Trust had identified multiple failings in its own assessment, made clear those failings existed, and then concluded on that same basis that the outcome had been unpreventable. NHS England subsequently launched its own investigation into the GMMF Trust. That investigation did not ultimately reverse the Trust's core conclusion, but it added external scrutiny to an institution that had already been found wanting in the eyes of the family and, in the coroner's view, by the evidence. The inquest into Emily Jones's death was held at Bolton Coroner's Court in 2023, more than 3 years after the killing. It lasted 8 days. The senior coroner, Timothy Brennand, heard from Clestora Skarna, from the psychiatrist responsible for Eltiona's care, from representatives of the Home Office, and from others involved in the various systems that had intersected with Skarna before the attack. What the evidence produced was a picture of multiple partial failures that individually could be presented as insufficient to have predicted the outcome, but that collectively represented a record of warnings, either not acted upon or not communicated across institutional boundaries. The change from injectable to tablet medication had removed the only reliable mechanism by which adherence could be ensured. The 6 weeks of missed face-to-face contact in the months before the attack had left nobody in a position to observe the deterioration that Skana's sister was observing from inside the flat every night. The visit to Bentley House 2 days before the killing had produced nothing because no clinician had been available in the time the sister was willing to wait. The Home Office had known that Skana's asylum claim rested on admissions she herself had described as lies. None of these facts, in isolation, constituted a clear trigger. Assembled, they formed the outline of a preventable death. Coroner Brennand, in his remarks, noted that someone with Skana's profile and history would once have been held in more restrictive conditions as a matter of course, and that the shift toward community-based care for people with serious mental illness carried risks that the system had not fully calibrated. He indicated he intended to write a report to the Minister for Health with a view to preventing future deaths of the same kind. Whether that report produced changes to practice is a question that goes beyond the scope of what the courts had before them. Emily Jones was a 7-year-old child in a park with her parents on a Sunday afternoon in March. The park was a few minutes from her home. She was on a scooter. She saw her mother jogging and called out to her. She was the victim of a stranger with a knife who had been sitting on a bench and who, by the time she rose from that bench, had not taken the medication that kept her illness from producing the kind of violence she had already produced in 2015 and in 2017. The system that was supposed to know that and supposed to do something about it had not been in face-to-face contact with her for 3 months. Eltiona Skana remains in secure detention. Parole consideration will come when the minimum term is reached and cannot result in release unless an assessment determines she is no longer a danger to the public. The park in Bolton where Emily Jones died has continued to be used by families on Sunday afternoons. Flowers and tributes appeared at the spot for years after the attack. The bench where Skana sat before she moved toward the child is still there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases of Hindley, Jenkinson, and Skana are each distinct in their character and their context, but they share the element that defines the hardest entries in Manchester's criminal record: violence against a child, and the question of how it was allowed to happen. Next, the video moves from killing to the criminal networks that sustained themselves across Manchester's streets for years, beginning with a group of women at the centre of a drug supply operation that ran 4 separate telephone lines and turned over millions of pounds a year from a safe house in Burnage. Section 4. The Operation Telegram Women Burnage is a residential neighbourhood in South Manchester, about 4 miles from the city centre, bounded by Levenshulme to the east and Didsbury to the west, made up of terraced streets and semi-detached houses, and the kind of ordinary domestic geography that makes it indistinguishable from a dozen other neighbourhoods in the same part of the city. There is nothing in the look of Barnfield Road that suggests it was, between March 2018 and March 2019, functioning as a staging post for a drug supply operation that investigators later estimated turned over between £1.5 and £3 million a year. The house on Barnfield Road looked like a house. The street looked like a street. Inside, a woman named Nicola Kieran ran a safe house through which cocaine, umdma, cannabis, ketamine, and prescription drugs flowed weekly before being carried out to street-level dealers across Greater Manchester. Kieran was born on 14 February 1982. She lived on Barnfield Road with her son Connor, who was born in January 2000, and was therefore 18 during the period the conspiracy ran. The two of them were embedded in the operation at its logistical centre. The safe house they occupied was the point at which drugs arriving from outside the city were broken down, packaged, stored, and redistributed. It was the point at which cash from dealers moved back up the chain. Nicola Kieran handled both directions of that flow. So did her son, and what made the Burnage address function was the fact that it looked, to any passing eye, like a family home. The organised crime group at the centre of Operation Telegram was structured in a way that investigators from GMP's Programme Challenger team would come to understand in detail across months of surveillance. At the top were 3 men: Faisal Nawaz, his cousin Kaisar Nawaz, and Yusuf Maya. All 3 were from Pelton Close in Manchester. On a weekly basis beginning in March 2018, They travelled to meet criminal associates in London, Oxford and Birmingham, where they took delivery of bulk quantities of drugs including cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, ketamine and Xanax. The drugs were brought back to Manchester and stored in a Ford Focus that served as a mobile stash vehicle. The car was the link between the supply end of the operation and the distribution end. It moved when the operation needed it to move. It sat quietly in residential streets when it did not. The Nawaz cousins and Maya controlled 4 separate drug telephone lines. These lines operated like any customer-facing commercial service. A user called a number, placed an order, and a street dealer delivered. The lines ran continuously, handling calls at all hours, directing dealers to locations, responding to demand as it shifted across the city. Analysis of the billing records for those 4 lines, conducted during the investigation, suggested the group was generating annual revenues of between £1.5 million and £3 million from drug sales alone. That range reflects the difficulty of reconstructing financial flows from a cash-based operation, but even the lower end of the estimate represents a significant and sustained commercial enterprise conducted from residential addresses in South Manchester. The street dealers who fulfilled the orders were Kane O'Connor, Aidan Jones, and Drew Downs. They used stolen cars to make deliveries. The cars were registered to cloned plates, meaning they carried the identification numbers of legitimately registered vehicles, making them harder to trace if spotted by police cameras. The plates and the cloning arrangements were not something the street dealers organized themselves. That function was performed by a woman named Louise Crossy. Crossy sent text messages to O'Connor and Jones, providing them with registration numbers they could use on the stolen vehicles. She also monitored police presence in the areas where the dealers were operating and sent them warnings when officers were nearby. This role sits at a particular intersection in a drug supply network. It is intelligence work, logistical support, and risk management, all without involving direct contact with the drugs themselves. The significance of that positioning is worth examining. Drug supply networks of the kind Operation Telegram investigated are structured so that exposure is distributed unevenly. The people who handle drugs are most exposed. The people who manage information, provide addresses, lease properties, and transfer cash occupy a layer that is harder to surveil directly and harder to prosecute under standard possession or supply charges. The functions are essential to the operation. They are also deniable in ways that carrying a kilo of cocaine in a car is not. Women in Manchester's drug supply networks, across the Operation Telegram case and others like it, appear disproportionately in these intermediate roles. The safe house, the rented flat, the intelligence layer, the logistics function. The pattern is not coincidental. It reflects a deliberate structural choice by the men who run these organizations, and it reflects the willingness of some women to occupy those positions. Lois Chubb's role in the Operation Telegram conspiracy illustrated the logic precisely. Chubb was born on 19 November 1987 and lived, during the conspiracy period, at Pelton Close in Manchester, the same address the Nawaz cousins used. She was working as a letting agent. That professional role gave her access to the residential property market in a way that other members of the OCG did not have. When the Ford Focus stash car was seized by officers from Waller Avenue in Fallowfield on 5 December 2018, with Class A and B drugs inside it worth an estimated £15,000 at street value, the immediate consequence was that the 3 principals of the operation discarded their phone numbers and relocated away from their regular operating areas. They moved to Manchester city centre and continued operating. To make that relocation possible, Faisal Nawaz and Maya needed somewhere to live that was not connected to them. Lois Chubb leased them an apartment. She leased it under a false name. The apartment gave the operation a new base and gave the police a problem. 2 of the 3 key figures had moved to an address not connected to them and were using telephone numbers that had been discarded and replaced. The seizure of the Ford Focus was a significant investigative moment, but it did not end the operation. The group adapted. The investigators adapted too. GMP's Program Challenger team had been building the evidential picture across months of surveillance, phone analysis, and monitoring of the supply routes. The conspiracy ran from March 2018 until March 2019, when the investigation produced the arrests and charges that eventually brought 11 people before the court. Casey Townsend, born on 26 October 1991 and living at Bloomfield Close in Stockport, was a regular presence with Faisal Nawaz during the collection of drugs from the stash car and during drug deals. Her role was not that of an administrator or a property agent. She was physically present at transactions. What that proximity means in legal terms is that it produced direct evidential links between her and the drugs themselves. Witness accounts, surveillance footage, phone records placing her at locations where exchanges took place. Townsend pleaded guilty to the supply of cocaine and cannabis. The trial found her additionally guilty of supplying umdma, ketamine and Xanax, as well as handling stolen vehicles. She was sentenced to 5 years and 10 months in prison. Nicola Kieran's position at the center of the safe house operation made her one of the most structurally significant women in the conspiracy. She pleaded guilty to the supply of cannabis. The trial found her additionally guilty of supplying MDMA, cocaine, and ketamine. Her son Connor was found guilty alongside her of supplying cocaine, cannabis, MDMA, and ketamine. The two of them had, between them, converted a family home in Burnage into a logistics node for a drug supply network covering Greater Manchester. The exchanges of cash and drugs between the street dealers and the safe house passed through both of them. 6 years and 6 months was the sentence Nicola Kieran received at Minchell Street Crown Court on 20 February 2020. Connor Kieran received 6 years. Lois Chubb was found guilty of supplying cocaine, cannabis, umdma, ketamine, and Xanax. The professional credential she had brought to the operation, her role as a letting agent, had been applied directly to the conspiracy when it was most needed, in the weeks after the stash car seizure, when the principals needed somewhere to live. That the apartment was leased under a false name demonstrated that the purpose was not incidental but deliberate. 6 years and 6 months, the same sentence as Nicola Kieran. The combined prison terms handed down across Operation Telegram totaled more than 76 years. The Nawaz cousins and Yusuf Meir each received 10 years and 6 months. Drew Downs received 7.5 years. Kane O'Connor received 7.5 years. Aidan Jones received 4 years and 9 months. The sentences reflected the different levels of the hierarchy each person had occupied, but the hierarchy itself, when laid out, showed women at almost every functional layer beneath the principals: the safe house, the property leasing, the stolen vehicle intelligence, the presence at collections. What the Operation Telegram case illustrates, in the broader context of Manchester's drug supply economy, is the degree to which women had become structurally integrated into criminal networks rather than incidentally attached to them. The women convicted were not partners who happened to be present. They were participants who held roles that the network depended on. Nicola Kieran's safe house was not a convenience. It was a necessity. Without a secure location in which drugs could be broken down and stored between supply and distribution, the 4 phone lines would have had nowhere to draw from. Without Lois Chubb's professional access to the rental market, the adaptation after the Ford Focus seizure would have been slower and the principals more exposed. Without the intelligence function Louise Crossy provided through her text messages about plates and police presence, the street dealers were more vulnerable on every run. The investigation that dismantled the operation was patient and methodical. GMP's Program Challenger team gathered its evidence over months, working surveillance and phone analysis in parallel, building a picture of who did what and where. DI Melanie Johnson, who led the team, described the group in the sentencing press release as brazen, noting that they had believed themselves to be above detection. The conviction of all 11 defendants across the conspiracy, including the women who occupied the logistical and administrative layers, demonstrated that the frame applied to drug supply prosecutions had expanded to reach those functions deliberately. The supply of a safe house address is supply of cannabis is the same structure, a person enabling the movement of a controlled substance through a network in exchange for the network's continued operation. Nicola Kieran, Lois Chubb, and Casey Townsend were all sentenced on the same February morning in 2020. At Minchell Street Crown Court, the Victorian Gothic building on Minchell Street in Manchester that has handled the city's most serious criminal proceedings since its completion in 1871. They were led from the dock and into custody. The safe house on Barnfield Road went back to being an address on a residential street. The phone lines that had generated somewhere between £1.5 and £3 million a year in drug revenue had already been dark for almost a year by then, discarded along with the numbers and the cars and the apartment that Lois Chubb had arranged when everything else was coming apart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Operation Telegram network showed how women in Manchester's organised crime had moved into every functional layer of a drug supply operation, from safe houses to property leasing to intelligence gathering. Next, the video covers a more recent case in which a woman was not just a logistics node in someone else's network, but was actively preparing and distributing cocaine from her own home in Clayton as part of a conspiracy that inherited its structure from a murder. Section 5, Kelly Blundell Clayton, is a district in the east of Manchester, between Beswick and Openshaw, a neighbourhood of residential streets that runs up against the boundary of the Etihad Stadium complex to the north and stretches south toward the Gorton border. It is an ordinary place, unremarkable from the outside, where families live in terraced and semi-detached houses on roads named after the geography they stand in. North Road is one of those streets. On 7 November 2025, a woman who lived at an address on North Road in Clayton was sentenced at Manchester Crown Court for answering a cocaine supply telephone line and coordinating the distribution of Class A drugs across North Manchester and the Tameside area. Her name was Kelly Blundell. She was 37 years old. She was also, at the time she was doing all of this, a registered foster carer. The drug supply operation Blundell became part of had not started with her. It had not started with the man who ran it when she was involved. The Campbell family organised crime group had its origins further back, in the criminal activities of a man named Thomas Campbell, who had built and operated a drug supply network in the North Manchester area before his death. On an evening in July 2022, Thomas Campbell was shot dead on the doorstep of his own home in Mossley, Greater Manchester. He was 38 years old. The killing was later established to have been a targeted attack, and the circumstances of his murder included the involvement of his own ex-wife, Colleen Campbell, who had plotted with a gang to target him. Thomas Campbell died on his doorstep, and when he did, the question of what happened to the criminal enterprise he had been running immediately arose. The answer was that his older brother, Lee Campbell, took it over. Lee Campbell was 43 years old at the time of sentencing. He lived at Lightfoot Walk in Beswick, a short distance from Clayton. His criminal record was substantial. He had served 3 years and 9 months for robbery, and had been jailed in 2015 for 4 years for possession with intent to supply cocaine. When he took over what prosecutors at his trial called the family business, he was inheriting a going concern with existing customers, existing supply contacts, and an existing infrastructure. He described the operation to investigators through his barrister as one in which he was himself a customer of those higher up in the cocaine distribution chain. He sourced the product from contacts abroad. He ran the supply downward through the Manchester area. The operation ran under Operation Kilowatt. The codename GMP's City of Manchester North Challenger team gave to their investigation when they launched it in May 2024. By that point, the Campbell OCG had been operating in North Manchester for long enough to have developed its concealment methods significantly. The central mechanism was a graft line, a mobile phone number used as the single contact point for customers. The number was the public-facing part of the operation, the point at which orders were placed. Everything else, the sourcing, the storage, the distribution, and the preparation, happened behind it. The hides were one of the most distinctive features of the operation. In the woodland areas of Clayton Vale and Phillips Park, both public green spaces in the Clayton and Beswick area, the OCG had constructed purpose-built concealment points, excavated spaces lined and covered, used to store cocaine sealed in smell-proof containers, packed into plastic snap bags. Some of the bags bore a red star symbol, a branding mark consistent with cocaine being sold under a consistent identity to repeat customers. The hides functioned as distributed storage. If one location was discovered or became too exposed, the operation did not depend on it. The concealed product was dispersed across multiple sites, each of which required investigators to find it before they could access it. Kelly Blundell's address on North Road in Clayton was not a hide. It was something more central, a preparation site. The investigation established that Blundell was involved in the preparation of cocaine for supply from her home. Preparation in the context of a drug supply operation means the stage at which raw cocaine is processed before it reaches the street-level dealer. This typically involves cutting, which is the addition of adulterant substances to extend the volume of cocaine while maintaining a plausible purity level for the customer, and packaging, which divides the prepared cocaine into the quantities in which it will be sold. The activity is physically closer to the product than running a safe house, and it is more technically integral to the supply chain. A house used as a safe house holds drugs. A house used for preparation actively processes them. North Road in Clayton was the latter. Beyond the preparation function, Blundell answered the drugs line. This placed her at the customer-facing end of the operation, as well as the production end. When a customer called the graft line to order cocaine, it was Blundell, among others, who received and coordinated that order. She was identified by investigators as working closely with Lee Campbell in running the line, which means her role was not peripheral. She was not someone who handled a single function in isolation. She was embedded in the operation across two of its most active points, the product coming in and the orders going out. Carlo Tomasello, who lived on Dwarf Road in Droylsden in Tameside, occupied a related but distinct role. He was described during proceedings as a gym contact of Lee Campbell and was identified as operating the graft phone itself. His role was to manage the phone line directly, responding to customer communications and directing supply. Surveillance footage captured him on multiple occasions entering the woodland areas of Phillips Park in Clayton, apparently making use of the hides. He received payment of up to £150 a day for operating the phone. His position was operational and consistent, and the surveillance record of him at the woodland sites connected him directly to the concealed cocaine stores. Stephen Quinn, who lived on Edge Lane in Droylsden and was 57 years old at the time the conspiracy ran, featured heavily in the day-to-day dealing. He had 13 previous convictions, including one for possession of crack cocaine. He operated as a street-level dealer on what the prosecution described as a significant scale. Quinn was the final stage in the supply chain, the point at which the cocaine reached the end customer. His role required regular contact with the graft phone, a knowledge of the geography of the delivery areas, and a willingness to move product in quantities that created personal risk if he was stopped by police. The investigation methodology that eventually brought the operation down was described in the GMP's own account of Operation Kilowatt as involving not just conventional surveillance, but unconventional technical approaches developed specifically because of the challenges posed by the Clayton Vale woodland sites. The concealed areas of the park made standard observation tactics difficult. The City of Manchester North Challenger team worked with GMP's technical surveillance unit to develop methods that could document activity in the woodland without requiring an officer to be physically present at the hide. Those methods produced the evidence of Campbell's activity in the park, including footage of him burying packages in December 2024. Officers found 16 packages buried in a hide at that location. 2 kilograms of cocaine were recovered, with an estimated street value of £95,600. Lee Campbell was arrested in the weeks that followed. Officers found him at his home in Beswick eating a mince pie. He was taken into custody and remanded. Following his arrest, the investigation continued, and a day of action produced warrants at multiple addresses, resulting in the arrests of 6 further members of the OCG, who were also charged and remanded. Blundell was among them. The sentencing hearing took place at Manchester Crown Court on 7 November 2025. Recorder of Manchester Nicholas Dean KC presided. In his remarks to Lee Campbell, he addressed the question of whether the circumstances of the operation's origins constituted mitigation. Campbell's barrister had argued that he had taken over the business following the traumatic death of his brother, and that this context should be considered. The recorder acknowledged that Thomas Campbell's murder would have had a significant impact on Lee, but found it amounted to little by way of mitigation in sentencing terms. He described Lee Campbell as having played a leading role in what was, at its core, his own business. He used an analogy that was specific and measured. Campbell had not been running a corner shop, and he had not been running a hypermarket. He had been running something between those two things, perhaps a small supermarket. Kelly Blundell's barrister, Joshua Bowker, presented mitigation on her behalf. She had found Thomas Campbell's murder difficult to come to terms with. She had, the court was told, become involved in the operation through a process that her defense characterized as being under direction, and her crimes were described as out of character with the rest of her life. The recorder sentenced her to 2 years and 8 months in prison. The detail that sat behind that mitigation, and which the court record makes available to anyone who looks, is that Kelly Blundell was a foster carer. She was, by her professional registration, a person assessed by the relevant authorities as capable of providing a safe and stable home for children who could not live with their own families. The standard for that assessment is not casual. Foster carers undergo checks, training, and ongoing monitoring by local authority services. A registered foster carer is, by definition, someone in whom the state has placed a degree of formal trust in relation to the welfare of children. Whether the two roles were simultaneously active, whether any child in her care was present in the house on North Road while cocaine was being prepared for distribution, is not something that the published court record addresses directly. What the record establishes is that the preparation of cocaine for supply took place at her home address, and that she was, at the time, registered as a foster carer. The recorder did not address this directly in the published sentencing remarks. The prosecution did not make it a central feature of the sentencing hearing, but it is a fact in the case, and it sits there in the record. The overall conspiracy covered the period from 14 March 2024 to 30 January 2025, which is 10.5 months. Investigators established that at least 16.5 kilograms of cocaine had been supplied during that period, with a value estimated at up to £1.6 million. The operation won GMP's Proactive Investigation of the Year award at the Chief Constable's annual awards ceremony, an acknowledgement of the technical innovation that had made the woodland surveillance possible. Di Claire Moss, who led the investigation, noted in her public statement that the OCG had made significant profits at the expense of vulnerable drug users and had given no consideration to anyone except themselves. Thomas Campbell was murdered in Mossley in July 2022. His brother Lee was arrested eating a mince pie in Beswick in late 2024. Kelly Blundell was arrested at her home on North Road in Clayton. 3 years separated the first event from the last. In the space between them, a drug line had been inherited, restructured, operated out of Woodland Hides and a residential address, and supplied cocaine across North Manchester and into Tameside until a surveillance team with unconventional methods found 16 packages buried in a park. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kelly Blundell prepared cocaine from a home address in Clayton, while registered as a foster carer, a detail that sits outside the usual parameters of organised crime and inside the record nonetheless. Next, the video moves east to Oldham, and to a younger woman who carried heroin and crack cocaine across the Pennines on trains and buses, then carried something else into a prison and was jailed for both. Section 6. Georgia Leigh. The Pennines begin at the eastern edge of Greater Manchester and rise quickly into moorland. On a clear day from the high ground above Oldham or Saddleworth, you can see the moors stretching east toward Calderdale, and beyond that into North Yorkshire. The railway that follows the Calder Valley across the range, connecting Manchester to Leeds and then to York, passes through a landscape that looks from the train like the boundary between two different worlds. The industrial conurbation on the Manchester side gives way within 20 minutes to open country, and within another 30 to the flatter, greener geography of the Vale of York. This is, in any ordinary reading, a journey between two cities separated by upland and history. It is also one of the corridors along which heroin and crack cocaine moved between Greater Manchester and the streets of York during the spring and early summer of 2020. In the court's language, it was a county lines operation. In the language of the people running it, it was the junior line. Georgia Leigh was 23 years old and lived at Bowling Green Close in Oldham when she was sentenced at Manchester Crown Court on 14th October 2021. She was the only woman among the 5 people who received an immediate custodial sentence that day. Her sentence was 4 years and 2 months. It covered 2 things: her role as a courier in the conspiracy to supply Class A drugs across the Pennines, and a separate charge of conveying List A articles into a prison. The second charge added 10 months to the total. The 2 charges together described someone who had not merely been present at the edges of a drug supply operation, but had moved drugs between cities and then, when members of the operation were incarcerated, had continued to serve the network by smuggling controlled drugs, mobile phones, cannabis, and tobacco through a prison gate. To understand what Georgia Lee was part of, it helps to understand how a county lines operation functions at its structural level. The term county lines refers specifically to the practice of using a dedicated phone number, a single line managed from an urban hub, to supply drugs to a rural or suburban market. The number is advertised to users. Customers call it to place orders. The people managing the line then organize delivery, typically using couriers who physically transport product from the urban supply point to the area being served. The line is the business identity of the operation. The couriers are its logistics function. And the market being served is, almost by definition, somewhere that does not have the same depth of local supply infrastructure as the originating city, which is what makes it commercially viable to export product across a significant distance. From the perspective of a criminal organization based in Oldham or Moston, North Yorkshire represented exactly this kind of market. York is a city with a drug-using population and, in 2020, a less saturated supply market than Greater Manchester. The distance, approximately 120 miles by road or rail, was manageable. The rail journey took under 2 hours. The M62 and A64 offered road alternatives. The Pennines were not a barrier, they were a commute. Jack Smedley was 24 years old and lived on Heppleton Road in Moston when Operation Homestead identified him as the controlling figure in the conspiracy. He directed the supply of heroin and crack cocaine to the rest of the group, who then organized its movement to the York market using couriers on road and rail. By the time he was sentenced in October 2021, Smedley was already serving 8.5 years for a separate conviction for supplying Class A drugs to York, a conviction obtained in April of that year. The 4.5 years added by the Homestead sentencing brought his total to 13 years. He had been supplying York from Greater Manchester across more than one operational period, which meant the cross-Pennine supply chain was not a temporary arrangement. It was an ongoing business model that had produced multiple prosecutions. The conspiracy that Operation Homestead investigated covered the period from April to June 2020. That period coincides with the first national lockdown of the coronavirus pandemic. It is worth noting the overlap, because county lines operations during the lockdown period have been specifically documented by law enforcement and researchers as having continued to operate despite public health restrictions. The lockdown reduced the visibility of courier movements in some respects, because the general reduction in public activity made certain patterns harder to monitor, but it did not reduce the demand for drugs in York or anywhere else. The junior line continued. Couriers continued to travel. Georgia Lee continued to move. What happened at the Yorkshire end of the operation, in York itself, involved the exploitation of vulnerable people in a practice the court named cuckooing. Cuckooing is the occupation of a vulnerable person's home for the purpose of storing and dealing drugs. The term describes what happens when a county lines network identifies someone, typically an individual with an addiction, a housing tenancy, and a limited ability to resist pressure, and uses that person's address as a base of operations in the destination city. The person's home is taken over, either through coercion, debt, or a combination of manipulation and implied threat, and becomes the local distribution hub from which street-level dealing operates. The original tenant is, in effect, displaced or controlled within their own home. 2 children, aged 16 or younger, were identified during Operation Homestead as having been used in this way, stored at cuckooed addresses in York and exploited to facilitate the supply chain. Both were safeguarded with the support of local authorities during the investigation. The involvement of children aged 16 in the delivery and storage end of a heroin and crack cocaine supply network is not an incidental feature of the county lines model. It is structural. County lines operators actively recruit young people, particularly those who are already in contact with social services, excluded from school, or living in unstable home environments, because those young people are more easily manipulated, and because, under the legal framework that applies to juveniles, they carry reduced criminal liability. The network profits from that calculation. The children absorb risk that the people directing the operation do not carry. DC Chris Brown, who led the Oldham Challenger team's investigation, described the situation directly. Vulnerable people were preyed upon, children as young as 16 were used, and the investigation had worked to ensure they were safeguarded from future exploitation. Georgia Lee's role in this operation was that of a courier. She carried drugs between the Greater Manchester supply point and the Yorkshire distribution area, using the road and rail networks that connect the two. She was 22 or 23 during the conspiracy period, which meant she was not herself a child being exploited, but an adult making choices about participation in a supply chain that was itself exploiting younger people at its far end. The court found her guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. The sentence that followed reflected the seriousness of that participation. The additional charge, the smuggling of List A articles into a prison, reveals something about the trajectory of the operation beyond its active period. List A articles are defined in English and Welsh prison law as the most serious category of contraband. They include Class A drugs, firearms, ammunition, and mobile phones. The seriousness of the designation reflects the harm these items cause within the prison estate. Class A drugs fuel addiction and debt that generate violence, and mobile phones allow incarcerated members of criminal networks to continue directing operations from inside. When someone smuggles List A articles into a prison, they are not acting alone. They are responding to a request from someone inside. They know who is inside and what the items are for. The 10 months added to Georgia Lee's sentence for this offence placed the smuggling into the context of the overall conspiracy, rather than treating it as an isolated act. She was serving the network even when parts of it had already been locked up. Operation Homestead ran for 18 months before it produced the day of action on the 1st of October 2020, when investigators from GMP's Oldham Challenger team, supported by North Yorkshire Police and the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit, executed warrants simultaneously at 10 properties across Manchester, Oldham, Tameside and York. 8 suspects were arrested and charged across those premises. The charges authorised on that day initiated the legal process that concluded at Manchester Crown Court 13 months later. The case produced a second Oldham woman with a connection to the conspiracy. Nicole Crichton was 22 years old and lived at Wilson Way in Oldham when she was found to have been concerned in the supply of Class A drugs. Her sentence was 2 years suspended for 2 years, with 150 hours of unpaid work. A suspended sentence reflects a judicial finding that the offending, while serious enough to warrant a custodial term in principle, does not require immediate imprisonment, typically because the court takes the view that the individual's circumstances and level of culpability place them at the lower end of the relevant range. Crichton's sentence sat at a very different point on the spectrum from Lee's immediate imprisonment, which suggests the court read their roles in the operation as significantly different in depth and centrality. The case also produced a more unusual defendant. Stephanie Beard was 27 years old and lived at Dumfries Avenue in Oldham. She worked as a civilian employee in the Administration Department of Greater Manchester Police. She pleaded guilty to possession of a controlled drug. Her conviction was recorded in August 2021, 2 months before the main sentencing hearing for the rest of the group. She received a 2-year conditional discharge. She had been suspended from her GMP post since September 2020, when the investigation first identified her connection to the case, and at the time of the October sentencing hearing, a misconduct hearing was pending to determine what would happen to her employment. A civilian employee within a police force administration department has access to information and processes that most members of the public do not. The nature and extent of what Beard knew or communicated about policing operations is not set out in the published record of the case. What the record establishes is that she possessed a controlled drug and pleaded guilty to doing so in the context of an investigation that had been running alongside a county lines conspiracy based in her hometown of Oldham. The court treated her offending as distinct from the conspiracy itself, handling it through a separate early hearing and a conditional discharge rather than the custodial sentences handed to the principal offenders. But the fact of a GMP employee appearing in the periphery of an operation that GMP itself was investigating is a detail that the published record preserves whether or not it was made central to the proceedings. The sentencing remarks made clear that the junior line had brought what North Yorkshire Police's DI Michelle Falkingham described as violence and misery to York. That framing, coming from a senior officer in the city that had received the drugs being moved across the Pennines, captures the directionality of county lines' harm. The misery does not stay in Manchester. It travels on the train to York, and it stays there in the bodies and homes of people who were there before the line arrived, and who will still be there after the sentencing hearing closes and the defendants are taken from the dock. Georgia Lee was sentenced to 4 years and 2 months. She was 23. The sentence covered a conspiracy that ran for 3 months in the spring and early summer of a year, when the rest of the country was largely indoors. The drugs crossed the Pennines anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Georgia Lee carried drugs across the Pennines and then carried them into a prison, both in service of the same network. Next, the video covers a very different kind of case. An older woman, a drug supply gang run out of Droylsden, and the 72-year-old who kept the stash house and told police, when they found ammunition in her shed, that she crossed her heart and hoped to die. Section 7. Sheila Mason Droylsden sits between Manchester's eastern edge and the Tameside boundary, a former mill town absorbed into the Greater Manchester conurbation, its terraced streets and older housing stock pressed against the Ashton Canal and the commercial sprawl of the Ashton Road. It is a neighbourhood where nobody looks twice at a house that appears to be a house, where a woman in her 70s doing nothing in particular is simply a woman in her 70s doing nothing in particular. That invisibility has a value. Organised crime groups understand it, and sometimes they build their logistics around it deliberately. Baguley Street in Droylsden is a residential street. The house at the address registered to Sheila Mason was her home. It was also, according to GMP's Serious Organised Crime Group, the stash house for a criminal network whose head referred to the woman who ran it by a single word. He called her Grandma. A stash house in a drug supply operation is one of the network's most essential and most carefully chosen assets. It is the physical point at which drugs arriving from the supply chain are held before distribution, and at which the cash generated by street-level sales returns before moving further up toward the principal. It exists to separate the drugs from the people who move them. A courier stopped with a car full of cocaine is a serious problem for the people who own that cocaine, but a stash house 3 miles away, containing everything else, represents continuity. As long as the stash house is unknown to the police, the operation can continue even through the loss of a courier, a car, or a load. The house needs to look unremarkable. It needs to be managed by someone unlikely to attract suspicion. It needs to be accessible to the people who need to use it without generating observable patterns. Sheila Mason, 70 years old at the time the investigation began, provided all of this. James Mulligan was 30 years old and lived at Hillside Close in Hyde when GMP's Serious Organised Crime Group launched their investigation into his activities in 2021. He was, according to the evidence that later emerged in court, the head of an organised crime group that was supplying drugs across the northwest of England and into North Wales. The structure beneath him was layered in a way that kept him removed from the physical handling of product. His second-in-command were David Keenan of Turner Street in Backup and Damien Batty of Crawford Street in Ashton-under-Lyne. They transported and collected drugs, supplying them downward to 3 men who sold directly to customers: Sibu Ngema, Richard Braisdell, and Michael Woodhouse. Below that layer were 3 further street-level operators: Tony McGough, Gary Holtham, and Lee Hamlet Clawley. And running alongside the entire distribution chain, unknown to the investigators when the operation began, were 2 additional elements: a family-run amphetamine laboratory and a stash house in Droylsden, run by a woman the head of the OCG called Grandma. The investigation moved through a series of surveillance operations across the spring, summer, and autumn of 2021, each one producing a piece of the picture that investigators were assembling. On 28 April, officers from Manchester, Merseyside, and West Yorkshire forces intercepted Mulligan and Keenan on the road back from Liverpool. Armed police stopped the vehicle. Inside the glove compartment was a handgun. In the car were 2 burner phones and around £25,000 in cash. Both men were arrested, gave no comment interviews, and were released under investigation. Within days, they were back operating the network. The scale of their confidence, or their calculation of the risk against the reward, meant that a firearms interception and a brief arrest did not stop them. On 1 May 2021, 4 days after the Liverpool interception, surveillance was underway at the property of Brian Mulligan Sr. on Treehouse Avenue in Tameside. Brian Mulligan Sr. was James Mulligan's father. An individual was observed leaving the property carrying a bag, getting into a car, and driving away. The individual was identified as Katrina Barton of Elton Street West in Wallsend in the northeast of England, which placed her at a considerable distance from the Manchester address she had just left. Officers from Durham Constabulary's Roads Policing Unit stopped the car. Inside, they recovered 2 blocks of heroin and 3 kilograms of bulking agent. The packaging on the heroin carried DNA that forensic analysis would later link to Brian Mulligan Sr. Barton was interviewed and released under investigation. She was rearrested and charged in October 2021. On 1 July, another surveillance operation intercepted Cebu and Ngema in transit toward North Wales. Officers recovered more than £10,000 worth of cannabis and cocaine, with a street value of around £17,000. On 12 August, surveillance followed Brian Mulligan Jr. travelling to Bradford with Holtham and Hamlet Crawley. A parcel was exchanged. GMP Roads Policing Unit intercepted the vehicle and found 1 kilogram of heroin inside. The packaging linked the 3 men to the heroin. Cell site analysis and ANPAR records showed they had made frequent trips to Bradford. The network was being mapped from multiple directions simultaneously. On the 2nd September, James Mulligan himself was observed meeting Michael Woodhouse to exchange a parcel. Woodhouse was stopped by police in Merseyside shortly afterward. He admitted being in possession of drugs. Officers recovered a bag of cannabis and 2 blocks of cocaine. Each of these interceptions was adding a layer of evidence, connecting individuals to the supply chain through physical seizures, surveillance footage, and forensic links. The warrant at the Welbeck Street South flat in Ashton-under-Lyne was executed on 21 September 2021. The flat was the home address of Brian Mulligan Sr. and Jr., the father and son who formed the production arm of the operation. When officers entered, Brian Mulligan Jr. attempted to flee through a neighbouring property belonging to an elderly man in the adjacent flat. He was detained. Brian Mulligan Sr. stayed in the apartment. Tony McGough, who was also present, attempted to escape over a balcony. He did not get far. What officers found when they searched the flat was not a domestic space. It was, in the words of the investigation, used purely to produce controlled drugs on an industrial scale. In the living room were PPE items, full hazmat suits and protective gloves, the equipment used by the people working in the production space to protect themselves from the chemical process they were managing. In other rooms were vacuum-sealed packages containing a white substance, large plastic packing crates, mixing bowls. There were large drums containing the chemicals used in the manufacture of amphetamine. The capacity of the setup, investigators estimated, was sufficient to produce hundreds of kilograms of amphetamine a month. The scale was not that of a cottage enterprise. It was that of a functioning industrial unit operating inside a residential flat in Tameside. 4 days after the meth lab warrant, on 25 September 2021, investigators executed a warrant at Bagley Street in Droylsden. The property belonged to Sheila Mason. She was 70 years old. What officers found when they searched the house was not dramatic in the way the meth lab had been. There were no hazmat suits, no production drums, no industrial mixing equipment. What there was, in the shed and in the house itself, was a set of items that told a specific story. There was ammunition. There was packaging material consistent with the wrapping of cocaine. There were electronic scales. On the scales, and on surfaces around them, there were residues: cocaine, caffeine, paracetamol, and levamisole. Levamisole is a pharmaceutical compound used primarily as an antiparasitic treatment in veterinary medicine. Its presence in a drug supply context is significant because it is one of the most commonly used adulterants in cocaine supply chains in the United Kingdom. When cocaine is cut for street sale, levamisole is among the substances most frequently added, because it is cheap, because it dissolves in a similar way to cocaine, and because it passes certain basic purity tests used by street buyers. Finding levamisole residue on scales in a domestic property is finding evidence of cocaine preparation. When officers questioned Mason about what they had found, She told them she did not know what ammunition was. She told them she did not know how it had come to be in her shed. She denied her involvement in the OCG. The phrase she used while denying it was recorded and repeated in the subsequent reporting of the case. She said she crossed her heart and hoped to die. The investigation later established that Sheila Mason occupied her position in the network because James Mulligan trusted her. The word he used for her, grandma, is not insignificant. It reflects the way the relationship was constructed, as something familial, something domestic, something that had the texture of a family arrangement rather than a criminal one. Organized crime groups use family relationships to reduce exposure for several reasons. Family members are less likely to cooperate with police against each other. Family relationships create bonds of loyalty that survive investigation. And the appearance of a family arrangement, when it is visible to outsiders, reads as normal. A woman in her 70s who is known to a younger man and who allows him and his associates to use her home is readable as a relative, an aunt, a family friend. The word grandma makes the relationship look like one thing, while it is, in operational terms, another. The role Mason played was the stash house. She was in control of the Droylsden property and its function as a holding and processing point for drugs moving through the Mulligan OCG's supply chain. The scales in her home, with their layered residues of cocaine and adulterants, were the tools of that function. The ammunition in her shed was linked to the wider network's firearms holdings. She pleaded guilty to assisting an organized crime group. That charge, rather than a supply charge, reflects the court's view of her position in the hierarchy. She was not directing supply, not sourcing drugs, not running couriers. She was providing the infrastructure on which other parts of the operation depended. The sentencing for the final group of defendants in the Mulligan OCG took place at Minshall Street Crown Court on 24 November 2023. The combined prison terms across all 11 defendants totaled almost 70 years. Mulligan himself had already been sentenced to 11 years and 7 months. Keenan and Batty had received 10 years and 8 months each. The father and son meth lab operators received 7 years 2 months and 4 years 6 months respectively. The street-level operators received sentences in the range of 18 months to 5 years and 4 months. Sheila Mason received a community order. The community order, rather than a custodial sentence, is the court's assessment of where her conduct sat in the overall picture. She had pleaded guilty. She was 72 at the time of sentencing. Her role, while essential to the operation, was at the supportive end of the hierarchy, rather than the directing end. She had not sourced drugs, had not moved them between cities, had not managed couriers or handled firearms directly. The ammunition in her shed was connected to the network, but the court did not find that she was the person responsible for its presence there, in a way that put her in the same category as the men who had transported and distributed multi-kilogram quantities of heroin and cocaine. Katrina Barton did not appear for the November 2023 sentencing. At the time the final hearing concluded at Minshall Street Crown Court, her sentencing had been deferred to a later date pending her attendance. The woman who had left Treehouse Avenue on 1 May 2021, carrying a bag that contained 2 blocks of heroin and 3 kilograms of bulking agent, and who had been charged in October of that year, was not in court when the rest of the OCG was sentenced. Her eventual sentencing, when it took place, would be a separate event from the one in which the rest of the network reached the end of its legal process. What the Mulligan OCG case shows, viewed through the position Sheila Mason occupied within it, is the degree to which organised crime in Greater Manchester had come to regard the domestic spaces of older women as useful infrastructure. The drug supply network that Mulligan had built ran from him, through 2 layers of couriers and distributors, into the streets and toward an end user. At one point in that chain was a flat in Ashton-under-Lyne producing amphetamine in industrial quantities. At another was a house on Baggerley Street in Droylsden where a 70-year-old woman kept scales with cocaine residue on them and ammunition in a garden shed, and, when police came to ask about it, said she crossed her heart and hoped to die. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sheila Mason denied knowing what ammunition was and received a community order for her role as the stash house operator in one of Greater Manchester's most complex drug supply networks. Next, The video covers a very different kind of case. Not a drug supply roll, not a stash house, not a county line. A kitchen in Prestwich, an elderly man, a vegetable knife, and a life sentence in the summer of 2026. Section 8. Daryl Berman. Butterstile Lane is a residential street in Prestwich, a suburban township in the borough of Bury, north of Manchester. It is the kind of street where people have lived for decades, where houses have been owned for long enough that the neighbours know each other's routines. A couple in their 70s and 80s who have been married for almost 30 years and live quietly at an address on that street are not remarkable. They are the expected inhabitants of that geography at that stage of life. Nothing about the address or the couple or the street would attract any attention from any direction. Until a Thursday afternoon in March 2025, when the Northwest Ambulance Service received a 999 call from a woman on Butterstile Lane who said her husband had fallen in the kitchen. When Greater Manchester police officers arrived at the house, paramedics were already in the kitchen attempting to revive David Berman. He was 84 years old. He had recently been diagnosed with dementia. He had a pneumothorax, a calcification in the upper chambers of his heart, and used a walking stick to get around. He was, by any reasonable measure, a physically vulnerable man. The paramedics worked on him in the kitchen. They could not revive him. David Berman was pronounced dead at 2:39 in the afternoon. The woman who had called 999 was his wife. Her name was Daryl Berman. She was 72 years old. When officers arrived, she spoke to them immediately. She asked why they were there. Then she asked a specific question, recorded in the police account of her response at the scene, that the prosecution would later place before the court. She asked whether they thought she had murdered him. Her account of what had happened was consistent from the moment officers arrived through the entirety of the investigation and through 2 trials. After lunch, she told them, David had taken her tray into the kitchen. She heard what she thought was a stumble, or 2 loud thuds, and went into the kitchen to find him on the floor. The fall, as she described it, felt to her like an accident, consistent with what she knew of his condition. He was prone to falls. He had a walking stick. His health had been declining. She had told a neighbour around this period that David's dementia had changed everything, that caring for him had become her whole life. When she went into the kitchen and found him, she said later in court, the experience had been like something outside herself. The kitchen floor, she told the jury, was bright red. The officers who arrived at Butterstile Lane initially proceeded on the basis that what had happened was consistent with Daryl Berman's account. A man in his 80s with dementia, a walking stick, a history of falls, found by his wife after an apparent accident in the kitchen. The circumstances were distressing but not immediately suspicious, in the way that an unexplained death might be in other contexts. Paramedics had worked on him. He had not survived. A post-mortem examination was ordered. 2 pathologists subsequently examined David Berman's body. What both examinations found was that his injuries were not consistent with a fall onto a knife. They were consistent with a stabbing. The distinction matters considerably in a forensic context. A wound caused by falling onto a blade produces a specific distribution of force and angle that differs from the wound caused by a blade being driven into the body by an external hand. The trajectory, the depth, the characteristics of the wound edges, the presence or absence of defensive injuries, all of these factors contribute to the pathologist's assessment of mechanism. Both pathologists who examined David Berman concluded that his injuries were more characteristic of a fatal attack than of an accidental fall. Daryl Berman was arrested. The knife was identified as a vegetable knife. It was a kitchen implement that had been in use that lunchtime. The judge, in her eventual sentencing remarks, used this detail precisely. She told Daryl Berman that she was satisfied that something had happened that caused her to lose her patience or temper, and to attack David with a knife that she had earlier used for her lunch. The vegetable knife was not a weapon brought to the kitchen for a purpose. It was the object that was there, at that moment, when something between 2 people who had been married for almost 30 years went wrong in a way that killed one of them. David Berman was, by the account of his community and his family, a man of standing in Manchester's Jewish community, where Prestwich has long been one of the main areas of residence and community life in the city's north. The Jewish community in Manchester is substantial, with synagogues, schools and community organisations concentrated in particular in Prestwich, Whitefield, and Salford. David Berman had been a recognized presence in that community. His diagnosis with dementia in the period before his death would have changed the nature of his daily life and of his relationship with Daryl, who had become, alongside everything else, his primary carer. The pressures of that transition, from partner to carer, are well documented in the literature on older couples dealing with dementia diagnoses. The erosion of reciprocity in the relationship, the practical demands of care, the grief involved in watching a person change, and the isolation that long-term caring can produce. None of those pressures constitutes a justification for violence. The judge did not treat them as such. She noted them as context for the moment something broke. The charge against Daryl Berman was murder. The prosecution's case was that she had stabbed her husband deliberately and had then constructed and maintained a false account of an accidental fall for the entire period between the killing and the verdict. This is one of the most legally demanding scenarios that a domestic murder prosecution faces. A death that occurred in a private space, witnessed by no one other than the two people involved, one of whom was dead, the other of whom maintained from the first moment that nothing unlawful had happened. The entire prosecution rested on the forensic evidence produced by the two post-mortems and on the jury's assessment of whether Daryl Berman's account was truthful. The first trial took place in December 2025. The jury deliberated and could not reach a verdict. They were discharged. The case returned to court for a retrial in 2026. On 24 June 2026, the retrial jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. The vote was 11-1. Daryl Berman was found guilty of murdering her husband of almost 30 years. She had denied it throughout. In court, she had maintained the account she had given from the moment officers arrived on Butterstile Lane: the thuds, the rush into the kitchen, the bright red floor, the out-of-body quality of finding him there. She had, over the course of the two trials, described the same sequence in the same terms, consistently. The jury, in the retrial, found the forensic evidence more persuasive than her account. Two pathologists and a prosecution that described her account as a lie that she had maintained from the scene to the witness box were, in the end, what the majority of the jury accepted. The sentencing hearing took place at Minchell Street Crown Court on the 3 July 2026. Judge Tina Landale presided. Before she passed sentence, victim impact statements were read on behalf of David Berman's family. His son, who shares his mother's first name Daryl, told the court that his life had changed dramatically since his father's death, that he felt cheated and deprived, and that not being able to say goodbye properly was something he would carry permanently. His daughter Debbie Davis told the court that she felt she was living in a nightmare that did not resemble normal life, that her father's death had left a massive void, and that she felt bereft and cheated of the time they should have had remaining with him. The statements carried the specific weight of grief that comes from a death in the domestic interior, a father killed in a kitchen by a person who was supposed to be the safest presence in his life. Judge Landale's sentencing remarks addressed the question of intention directly, which was significant. A finding of murder in English law requires the prosecution to prove that the defendant intended either to kill or to cause grievous bodily harm. The judge stated that she was satisfied Daryl Berman had not intended to kill her husband, but had intended to cause him really serious harm. This is an important legal distinction because it affects the characterization of the offense without affecting the verdict. The jury had found the charge of murder proved, and intention to cause really serious harm satisfies that charge under English law, even in the absence of an intention to kill. What the judge was doing in making this finding was placing the act within a specific human moment, rather than treating it as a coldly calculated killing. She found that something had happened, something between them in the kitchen on 13 March 2025, that had caused Daryl Berman to lose her patience or her temper and to reach for the knife. And then, the judge found, she had immediately regretted it. And then, she had picked up the phone and called 999 and described it as an accident and maintained that account for the next 15 months. The minimum term was set at 12 years. Daryl Berman was 72 at sentencing, which means she will be at least 84 years old before she becomes eligible to be considered for release by the parole board. The minimum term is the point at which she can apply for parole. It is not a release date. Release depends on the board's assessment that she no longer presents a danger to the public, a calculation that will be made when she is a very old woman. DI Alex Wilkinson, who led the investigation for GMP's major incident team, said in a statement after sentencing that David Berman should have been able to enjoy his later years in the safety of his own home, and that he had instead been killed by the person he trusted most. The investigation, he noted, had found from the outset that Daryl Berman had tried to present her husband's death as a tragic accident, and that the post-mortem findings had exposed the truth. The post-mortems were what made the case. Without them, the account of an old woman finding her even older husband on a kitchen floor after a fall might have remained exactly what it appeared to be on a Thursday afternoon in March 2025. What distinguishes the Berman case from every other entry in this video is the context in which it occurred. There are no drug lines here, no supply chains, no county lines operations, no stash houses. There is a home in Prestwich, a kitchen, a lunchtime, and a 12-year marriage that became a 30-year marriage and ended in a moment that a judge described as a loss of patience or temper and a subsequent 15 months of sustained false account. The court process took 2 trials and produced an 11-1 verdict. The sentence is a life sentence. David Berman is buried. His son and daughter are living with the knowledge of how he died and who was responsible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Berman case is the most recent life sentence handed down to a woman in Greater Manchester, delivered on 30 July 2026, 5 days before this video was published. Next, the video broadens its frame to cover the women who operated safe houses, answered drug lines, and provided cover for major organised crime groups across Manchester in the years covered by this series, and what those roles collectively reveal about how the city's criminal networks are built. Section 9. The Safe Houses and Support Roles. Stretford Road in Hume runs south from the edge of Manchester city centre through one of the oldest continuously inhabited parts of the city, a neighbourhood that has been rebuilt twice since the 1960s and retains something of the compressed, close-built quality of its earlier form. In the summer of 2025, officers from GMP's City of Manchester Central Challenger team executed a warrant at an address on that road on 17 July. The home belonged to a 24-year-old woman named Shasha Clark, who had been born on 23 April 2001. When officers forced their way into the property, they found a cannabis farm with 24 plants growing in one part of the address, and, in another, a large quantity of crack cocaine and heroin ready to be supplied. The cannabis plants indicated cultivation over a period of weeks. The crack cocaine and heroin indicated something else. Clark was not growing cannabis for her own use and keeping a small personal supply of Class A drugs nearby. She was operating as a node in a supply network, and the network was using her address as its storage point. Mobile phone evidence recovered from the address and analysed during the subsequent investigation told the investigators what they needed to know about the nature of Clark's role. She had been acting as a safe house for drug suppliers, storing illegal commodities at her home for other members of the network who needed a location that was not directly connected to them. 2 further suspects were identified through the phone evidence as using the Stretford Road address for this purpose. Kobe Rowe, 28 years old and living at Study Close in Manchester, and Aaron Jackson, 30 years old and living at Ivy Mead Road in Macclesfield. When officers executed a warrant at Rowe's address, they found 400 wraps of crack cocaine and 300 wraps of heroin ready for street-level sale, alongside £7,000 in cash. The wraps were the product. The cash was the revenue. The Stretford Road address had been where the stock came from before it reached Rowe's hands and then the hands of buyers. Shasha Clark was sentenced at Manchester Crown Court on 6 November 2025, 2 years and 5 months for being concerned in the supply of crack cocaine and heroin and for the cultivation of cannabis. She was 24 years old. Rowe received 3 years and 8 months. Jackson received 5 years and 6 months. The disparity in the sentence lengths reflects the court's reading of their respective depths of involvement. Clark provided the address, the space, the cover. Rowe and Jackson were closer to the product in ways that the prosecution could establish more directly. But the safe house, in the geography of a drug supply operation, is not a peripheral service. It is the fulcrum around which the rest of the distribution function turns. Without the Stretford Road address, The product had nowhere to rest between acquisition and street sale. The cannabis farm inside was a supplementary enterprise, but the crack cocaine and heroin stockpile was the core, a well-located residential address in Hume, connected to the distribution network by mobile evidence and operated by a woman who had been born in the year 2001. On Rudston Avenue in Moston, a couple had been together for 17 years. Rachel Blackburn Stanley was born on 31st of October 1990. Her partner, Anthony Hunt, was born on 6 March 1985. They shared the address on Rudston Avenue. What they also shared, between March and October 2024, was a proximity to one of Greater Manchester's most significant drug supply operations of that year, a wholesale network controlled by Thomas Hunt, Anthony's older brother, who worked from his house in Middleton and directed the movement of cocaine, heroin, mandama, and amphetamine to customers across the north of England and beyond. The Thomas Hunt operation was described at sentencing as functioning on a commercial scale. The products it moved were multiple: cocaine, heroin, MDMA, and amphetamine, each serving a different market segment, all sourced, stored, and distributed under a single operational umbrella. Encrypted applications and mobile phones were used for communication between the principals. Self-storage units spread across the Manchester area held the stock between deliveries. Trusted couriers carried drugs and cash across the United Kingdom in private vehicles, maintaining contact with the centre throughout their journeys. When officers eventually struck, across 2 days of raids in October 2024, they recovered over 15 kilograms of cocaine, 1.8 kilograms of heroin, 6.4 kilograms of amphetamine, nearly 7,000 ecstasy tablets, 75,821 pounds in cash, and 224 rounds of viable ammunition. The total value of the drugs moved through the operation during the conspiracy period was assessed at more than £1.8 million. Anthony Hunt's role within his brother's network was to handle stock and equipment. He moved product between storage locations, maintained contact with the distribution chain, and was arrested inside one of the OCG's safe houses on Moss Bank in Crumpsall, where his DNA was found on gloves at the address. Further searches at Rudston Avenue, the home he shared with Blackburn Stanley, linked him to cocaine and heroin. Blackburn Stanley's role was one step removed. She drove him to and from the group's drug storage locations. She drove him to conduct 2 specific exchanges with Stanley Ainsley, the courier and storeman, who had himself been arrested in Gorton with more than 6 kilograms of amphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and cash at his address. She also drove Anthony Hunt to the Moss Bank safe house in Crumpsall on the day it was raided, to a meeting with another woman who had arrived from overseas the day before and who was waiting for instructions. That woman was Lisa Prescott. Her partner was a man named James Close, who had been jailed for 36 years in the course of 2025, a sentence that placed him among the longest-serving drug trafficking defendants in Greater Manchester's recent criminal history. The 36-year sentence reflected the gravity and scale of whatever Close had been doing before his incarceration. What the evidence in the Hunt OCG prosecution then established was that Close had continued operating from inside prison. He had maintained communication with the outside network, directing the movement of product and the activities of associates including Prescott, through a channel that passed instructions outward from his cell and back into the supply chain. Prescott had returned from Turkey the day before the Crumpsall raid. She told her daughter, in a communication the investigation recovered, that she was awaiting instructions. What followed was a sequence of contact between Close, in prison, Dylan Robinson, who was Thomas Hunt's hands-on logistics controller, Prescott herself, and Anthony Hunt, all of which preceded the meeting at the Crumpsall flat. When officers searched that flat, they found 11 kilograms of high-purity cocaine, with a wholesale value estimated at between £308,000 and £352,000. They also found a press and 5 kilograms of adulterants for cutting the cocaine before street sale. The flat was a cutting and storage point. Prescott had arrived there, from Turkey, after a communication chain that ran through a prison wall. The capacity for a convicted and imprisoned principal to continue directing criminal activity from inside custody is a persistent and documented feature of serious organised crime in England and Wales. Encrypted messaging, contraband phones, and trusted associates outside the walls allow some individuals to maintain the operational direction of a network even after removal from it. What makes the Prescott element of the Hunt case notable is the specific detail it provides. A man serving 36 years, directing a woman who had just arrived from abroad to attend a meeting at a flat in Crumpsall that contained 11 kilograms of cocaine, all of which was in motion because a network that police were already watching had not stopped functioning when its most important member was incarcerated. Rachel Blackburn Stanley drove Anthony Hunt to that meeting. Lisa Prescott attended it. Both women were, in their different ways, the human logistics of a network whose principal was not free to make the journey himself. Blackburn Stanley was sentenced to 18 months in prison, suspended for 9 months, with 15 rehabilitation activity requirement days. She had admitted participating in the activities of an organized crime group. The suspended sentence reflected the court's assessment of where her role sat. She had driven someone to exchanges and to a safe house. She had not sourced drugs, not stored them, not couriered them across the country. She had provided the car and her presence to a partner she had been with for 17 years. The suspension meant she served no immediate custodial time. Prescott's sentencing details were handled separately in the proceedings. She had participated under the direction of a man serving 36 years for his own crimes, on Benton Street in Moston, not far from the address Rachel Blackburn Stanley shared with Anthony Hunt on Rudston Avenue. A warrant was executed on 6 March 2024 at the home of Katie McCann, who had been born on 27 September 1997. McCann was connected to a different OCG altogether, the Bobby Vernon and Darren Ray conspiracy, a wholesale drug supply network covering Manchester, Rochdale, Oldham and their surrounding areas. Vernon, from Kingsway in Middleton, was the head. Ray, from Abbeydale Road in Moston, was his principal associate. Both had previous convictions for drug trafficking and had been subject to serious crime prevention orders at the time the conspiracy ran. Both continued anyway. What officers found at McCann's address on Benton Street when they executed the March 2024 warrant was not a cannabis farm or a wrapped supply of street-level drugs. It was equipment. They found heroin. They found 154 MDMA tablets. They found adulterant in the form of caffeine and paracetamol powder, the cutting agents used to extend the volume of cocaine and heroin before street sale. And they found 6 hydraulic presses and other drugs preparation paraphernalia. The number of hydraulic presses is significant. A single hydraulic press, used to compress cut cocaine or MDMA into a block or a tablet, is itself a piece of controlled equipment in the context of a drug supply prosecution. It is evidence of production at scale rather than personal use. 6 presses at a single residential address indicated a preparation operation of some volume, a function being performed regularly enough to require multiple simultaneous machines at a house on a residential street in Moston. McCann pleaded guilty to permitting the use of premises for the supply of Class A drugs, cocaine, and Class B drugs, amphetamine. She received a community sentence. The OCG she had facilitated through her address received altogether different outcomes. Vernon was jailed for 14 years and 8 months, Ray for 13 years and 4 months, and 2 further members of the conspiracy for 9 years and 7 months each at Manchester Crown Court on the 2nd December 2025. The combined sentence for the principals and the key couriers was close to 50 years. McCann's community sentence, set against that backdrop, sits at the distance that courts have consistently placed between the person who provides the address and the people who control the network. That distance matters as a legal and analytical category, and it is worth examining what it means in practice. Across the cases covered in this section, a pattern emerges from the sentencing outcomes that reflects a consistent judicial reading of how women have appeared in Manchester's drug supply networks. Shasha Clark, who ran a safe house and grew cannabis in Hume, 2 years and 5 months. Rachel Blackburn Stanley, who drove her partner to exchanges and a safe house, suspended. Katie McCann, who provided a Moston address for preparation and storage, community sentence. The pattern is not uniform across all women in all cases. Nicola Kieran in Section 4 received 6.5 years, and Kelly Blundell in Section 5 received 2 years and 8 months. But the women in this section represent the lower end of the sentencing range. and the common feature of their cases is that their functional role was to provide a resource, an address, a vehicle, a domestic space, rather than to direct, source, courier, or control the product itself. What that consistent pattern reveals is something about the architecture of organised crime in Manchester. The network in each case required the address more than it required the person. The Stretford Road address in Hume was where the stock lived. The Benton Street address in Moston was where the preparation happened. The Rudston Avenue house in Moston was where Anthony Hunt lived, and from which Rachel Blackburn Stanley could drive him where he needed to go. The women who occupied these positions were essential to the network in the way that infrastructure is essential, not glamorous, not visible, not usually thought of as the primary actors, but without which the thing does not function. The challengers and the SOC teams who investigated these OCGs understood this, which is why the prosecution of safe house operators and address providers became a routine feature of Greater Manchester organised crime cases from the mid-2010s onward. Providing a house to a drug network is not a passive act. The courts treated it as participation and built sentences accordingly, even when those sentences were suspended or expressed as community orders. Letitia Sandys, 39 years old and from Salford, received 2 years and 3 months at Manchester Crown Court in July 2026, the most recent of the sentences covered in this section, for a role that the prosecution described in notably specific terms. She had provided legitimacy to drug supply activity, collected drugs from conspirators, assisted with anti-surveillance measures, and disposed of drugs and drug paraphernalia. The legitimacy function is perhaps the most analytically interesting component of that description. Providing legitimacy to drug supply activity means acting in a way that makes the supply operation look more ordinary or more defensible than it is, either by being present as a normalizing figure in an environment under surveillance, or by conducting transactions that would attract attention if performed by a known OCG member, but do not if performed by someone without that profile. It is a function that requires a person who is not visibly connected to the network and who can move through ordinary environments without triggering the scrutiny that a principal or a known courier would attract. The court found that Sandys had performed this function and sentenced her accordingly. Across Stretford Road in Hume and Benton Street in Moston, and Rudston Avenue in Moston, and the Crumpsall Safe House on Moss Bank, and a flat in Salford, the operational infrastructure of Greater Manchester's drug supply networks in 2024 and 2025 included women in their 20s, 30s and early 40s, providing the residential and logistical base on which cocaine, heroin, crack, umdma and amphetamine moved through the city and out into the surrounding regions. Their sentences ranged from community orders to 2 years and 5 months. The men who directed the operations they supported received between 9 and 18 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the Hulme cannabis farm to the Crumpsall cocaine flat to a Moston house containing 6 hydraulic presses, the safe house and the support role became the most consistent point at which women entered Manchester's organised crime record across the decade covered by this video. In the final section, the camera pulls back across all 10 cases, all 10 women, and all the sentences handed down, and asks what the complete picture reveals about the city these crimes were committed in. Section 10, Shazia Din Bury, sits 8 miles north of Manchester city centre, on the A56, a market town, absorbed into Greater Manchester's sprawl, but retaining a character distinct from the city it borders. Its market is one of the oldest and largest in the north, running on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays in the town centre, a place where local traders sell produce and goods alongside the usual mix of clothing and household items that fills the stalls of any northern market town. The town's economy is unremarkable in the way that market towns usually are. Small businesses, retail, light industry, the ordinary commercial activity of a community of around 80,000 people. Nothing about the market or the town centre or the residential streets that run outward from it suggests that Bury was, between some point before December 2018 and July 2019, home to one end of a cross-Pennine drug supply operation that GMP investigators later assessed as producing a criminal network sentenced to a combined total of 139 years and 6 months in prison. The address on the drive in Bury was home to two of the three Din siblings at the center of the operation. Shazia Din was born on 25 October 1977. Her brother Abia was born on the 5 April 1975. Her other brother Hassan was born on the 12th January 1999. Their business, the visible commercial enterprise that provided the surface explanation for their activity, was an online beauty product supply company. It was a functioning business in the sense that it had an online presence and sold beauty products. It was also, according to the evidence assembled across GMP's 2-year Operation Heart investigation, a front, a legitimate business entity through which the proceeds of Class A drug supply could be processed and the cash movements of a criminal enterprise given the appearance of commercial legitimacy. The use of a legitimate business as a cover for drug supply proceeds is not unusual in organized crime. Cash generated by street-level drug sales is inherently suspicious when it enters the financial system, because it has no documented origin that can be explained by a payslip or a commercial invoice. A running business with accounts, stock records, and customer transactions provides exactly that documentation. Money deposited as business income becomes, in the record, the proceeds of selling beauty products online, not the proceeds of selling heroin and crack cocaine through couriers between Bury and Doncaster. The business does not need to be large or particularly successful to serve this function. It needs to be plausible enough that a routine examination of the accounts does not immediately flag the transactions as suspicious. The Din siblings' beauty business served that function. What the business concealed was a supply chain that ran from Bury eastward over the Pennines to Doncaster in South Yorkshire. On the Bury side, the operation was managed by Shazia Din and her two brothers. On the Doncaster side, the operation was managed by a man named Peter Rafter, who operated his own network of couriers and customers in South Yorkshire, and who had formed the arrangement with Shazia Din that underpinned the whole enterprise. The two of them, the court found, had colluded to build the network together. Rafter brought the South Yorkshire distribution infrastructure. Din brought the Greater Manchester supply. The couriers on each side of the Pennines transported drugs eastward and cash westward, along road routes that crossed the high ground between Manchester and Doncaster, through the M62 corridor and its surrounding A roads. Those roads carry millions of legitimate journeys a year. The couriers driving packages of Class A drugs along them were indistinguishable from the traffic around them. Vulnerable people's homes featured in the evidence as cuckooed properties, addresses occupied for drug storage and dealing at the Yorkshire end of the supply chain and possibly at the Manchester end too. Cuckooing is the exploitation of a vulnerable person's tenancy for criminal purposes, a practice that places the cost of exposure onto someone who typically has no power to resist the people using their home and no means to remove them. The investigation established that a host of vehicles and properties had been used for the movement and storage of drugs, cash, and mobile phones, some of which were residences belonging to people who had been exploited in this way. Peter Rafter was arrested and convicted in the course of the investigation before the main body of Operation Heart reached its conclusion. His conviction removed him from the network, but it did not stop it. In his place, his daughter, Nicola Rafter, stepped into the role her father had occupied. She continued to collude with Shazia Din. The network kept running. The supply kept moving. Thousands of pounds were seized from an address in Bury, controlled by the Din family during the investigation period, which indicated the scale of the cash flow through the northern side of the operation, even as investigators were already watching it. In December 2018, GMP's Serious and Organised Crime Group formally initiated Operation Heart, targeting those responsible for the trading of bulk quantities of Class A drugs between the Bury area and Doncaster. From that moment, the investigation moved through a sequence of arrests, evidence collation, and intelligence building that eventually produced the final day of action. On Wednesday, the 24 July 2019, GMP coordinated the final day strike. Shazia Din was arrested. Hassan Din was arrested. Abia Din was arrested. Nicola Rafter, who had taken over her father's coordinating role on the Doncaster side, was also arrested. By the point of the strike, a significant number of the network's other members had already been arrested in the preceding months, and Rafter himself was already convicted. What the final day action did was close the loop on the principals who had remained operational throughout. The Din siblings had, to that point, continued running the berry end of the supply chain even as arrests accumulated around them, even as the investigation watched them, even as the network below them shed members into custody one by one. The investigation had by that point accumulated a significant evidential picture. Across the vehicles and properties associated with the operation, officers had recovered £3 million worth of drugs, £300,000 in cash, a firearm and ammunition. The firearm and ammunition placed the operation in a context that went beyond simple drug supply. A network that holds a weapon is a network prepared, at some level, for the kind of confrontation that weapons are kept to prevent or enable. Whether the firearm was used or was held as insurance is not addressed in the published record of the case. Its presence was treated by the prosecution as an aggravating feature of an already serious conspiracy. The coronavirus pandemic delayed the final sentencing hearing. Court proceedings across England and Wales were severely disrupted from March 2020 onward. As buildings closed, juries could not be convened, and cases awaiting trial or sentencing backed up in a system that had already been under pressure before the pandemic began. Operation Heart's final defendants, including the Din siblings, reached their sentencing hearing between Monday the 27th July and Wednesday 29 July 2020, more than a year after their arrests. A further batch of defendants, the Doncaster side couriers and associates, were sentenced in December 2020. The combined total when all 20 defendants had received their sentences was 139 years and 6 months. Abir Din received 18 years at Manchester Crown Court. He was the eldest of the 3 siblings and the most senior figure in the Berry operation at the point of sentencing. Shazia Din received 15 years. Hassan Din received 14 years. Natalie Rafter, who had been part of the Doncaster side of the network, received 11 years and 3 months. Nicola Rafter, who had replaced her father as the coordinating contact with Shazia Din after his conviction, was among those sentenced in connection with the conspiracy. 15 years. It is the longest sentence handed to any of the women covered in the 9 preceding sections of this video who received a determinate term rather than a life sentence. It is longer than Nicola Kieran's 6.5 years. It is longer than Georgia Lee's 4 years and 2 months. It is longer than Kelly Blundell's 2 years and 8 months. It is longer, by a significant margin, than every other custodial sentence given to a woman in any of the drug supply cases in this video. And the reason it is longer is not simply because the drugs seized were worth more than in other cases, or because the geography of the operation was wider, but because of where Shazia Din sat in the structure of what she was part of. Every other woman in the drug supply sections of this video occupied a role that was either adjacent to the directing layer or below it. Nicola Kieran ran a safe house. Lois Chubb leased a flat. Casey Townsend was present at collections. Kelly Blundell ran a line and prepared product from home. Shasha Clark was a safe house operator. Katie McCann permitted her premises. Rachel Blackburn Stanley drove her partner to meetings. Georgia Lee carried product as a courier and then carried contraband into a prison. All of these roles are criminal. All of them contributed to supply chains that generated harm, and all of them are represented in the record by sentences that the court calibrated against the distance between the role and the directing authority above it. Shazia Din was not below the directing authority. She was part of it. She and Peter Rafter colluded to form the network. The court's language on this point is specific and it matters. They did not describe her as assisting the network, or as participating in the activities of an OCG, or as permitting her premises to be used for supply. They described her as one of the 2 people who had built the thing together and run it. She was, in the language that would have been applied to her male counterparts in any equivalent prosecution, a principal. She received a principal's sentence. What this says about the specific criminal history of Greater Manchester, viewed through the lens of this video, is that the structural pattern described in Section 9 is not universal. Most women who appear in the city's organised crime record occupy support and logistics roles, and their sentences reflect that positioning. But the pattern has exceptions. The Din case is the clearest exception in the cases covered here. A woman who founded and directed a supply operation across 2 police force areas, using a legitimate business as a front, managing a family-based hierarchy of supply, maintaining the operation through the arrest and conviction of her co-founder on the other side of the Pennines, and continuing to run it until a final day strike in July 2019 brought the network down. 15 years. The beauty product business is no longer operating. The addresses on the drive in Bury are still there. The M62, along which the couriers drove their packages east across the Pennines and their cash back west, still carries millions of journeys a year in both directions. D.I. Lee Griffin of GMP's Serious and Organised Crime Group said after the sentencing that the investigation had scrutinised the group intensely as it uncovered their illicit activities across the country, and that the results sent a clear message that GMP would work with colleagues around the UK to relentlessly pursue those who supply harmful drugs across forced borders. That message was sent to a prison reception desk in July 2020. Shazia Din received it with 15 years to serve. The case belongs to a category that Greater Manchester's criminal record has relatively few examples of across the years covered by this video. A woman at the top of a drug supply organisation, not below it, not adjacent to it, but building it, running it, and facing a sentencing outcome that reflected that position without qualification. Most of the women in this video received sentences calibrated to their distance from the directing layer. Shazia Din received a sentence calibrated to the fact that she was it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.